Okay, just a few words to tell you how exceptionally lucky we are to have here Guido Calabresi, whom I will define a piece of history of line economics, perhaps the very roots of it. But you know, in fact, he's so charming and young that it cannot be described that way. But anyway, he is actually the personal incarnation of an amazing movement that developed from this article in the early 60s, known as Land Economics and the Economics Analysis of Law. Of course, there have been a variety of other co-stars, but you know, the foundational one is here right with us. And so it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce him. And these three lectures that he's going to give, two of them here, and the third one at the inaugural tomorrow, are going to be very interesting. One of those, historical and introductory, will give us a flavor of the discipline, its meaning, its significance in the past and in the present, I guess. If I know Guido's work well enough, they claim I do actually. I think I read every single line that Guido wrote in his life, so I can claim that. Then tomorrow, then there is the one on Towards the Law of Society that, according to me, is perhaps the most significant theoretical piece that he produced, even if it was published in a relatively, it was not like made in a book, but it should have been. It was an article in Texas Law Review, and I think there is really sort of some very important basic foundational idea about how society should look like. If we had you know, a democratic system, if we had a system that was at the same time respectful of individual liberties and of the needs of society to hold together. It's a very important book. It starts from a technical issue, which is an issue in the law of torts, but it expands a lot out of there, and to me has been really kind of a very important piece in my own understanding of the legal reality around us. So I'm particularly happy of that one. And then, you know, there is going to be the final firework, which is going to be the Mary Goods piece that I've never heard because I think it doesn't exist, right? And so it's brand new here for us. So without further ado, one other thing I want to say. Guido is responsible for much of the curriculum of this place. He was with us in Pollenzo when we had a meeting to organize the International University College and the Master of Law and Finance program. And the idea of the course that Tala is teaching this year, for example, the Incentive of Regulation course and the Foundations courses. So all the bulk of the program has been actually really discussed with Guido, and was Guido's contribution to say that those were the areas that were foundational in a program that tries to get to basic research in this field. Okay? So without further ado, Guido, thank you very much for being with us. Ciao.
So, one thing first, the law of the ideologically mixed society, actually Ugo's right, it was originally planned to be a part of a book with the cathedral article, and then something happened, I got involved in other things, and so that book never got written. What is going on now, in my own thinking, is something starting from what I'm doing today, and this morning, and this afternoon, and then tomorrow will be an example of where I am going, which really tries to put all of these things together. And it's what I'm working on now, which I hope I will be able to do, and to do another book really on law and economics and its future in an ideologically mixed society. So we'll see where this goes, but in a way all three of these talks, these two classes and tomorrow, are all part of the same story. So let's begin. Where does, and today I'll say some things that have been said before, where does law and economics and something different, economic analysis of law, fit in the whole world of legal thought? That's the first thing. Well, actually, it is a subcategory of a category, one of at least four, of ways of looking at law. So you should think that it will be a very small thing. And yet it has become extraordinarily important. But let's begin by putting it in its context in legal thought as a whole. The traditional way of thinking about law, dominant primarily in continental European countries, Germany especially, but Italy also, but also very important in the United States and in other places, is law as a self-contained system. Law as a system of rules which lives by itself, has very little to do, though it affects dramatically the world, and the job of a scholar and the teacher and the judge is simply to make it coherent, consistent, and that's it. In rebellion against that, because that was an enormously conservative way of looking at things, it could only, conservative and in a way radical, it could only be changed by a revolution. Otherwise, everything stayed as it was, and how it got there, who knows. A series of ways of thinking, which I call law and, developed, which permitted people to criticize, analyze, reform this closed system of law. Law and was a place to stand on from which you could move the legal world. A place you could put your balance, which you can move. The first really dramatic law and person was Bentham, who took his philosophy, utilitarianism, and became a radical reformer. Said, we change all of law from looking at it from that point of view. Law and involves many different ands. Law in economics is one, law in sociology is another, law in philosophy is another, law in history is another, law in literature too. You look to the great canons of literature and how they dealt with certain problems to see how to criticize, look at the law. So law in economics was only one of these law and things. In rebellion against it, people who said, yeah, but is law only the servant of some other discipline? The legal process movement developed, which treated law separately again, but not in the formalistic way that the first group did. This was a great Harvard contribution of the early 20th century. And it said, what law and legal scholarship can do is decide who can decide, who is best suited to decide an issue. Is it a legislature? Is it a court? Is it a jury? Is it an administrative agency? The issue for law is not what the answer is, but who, what institution should make the answer. So we have at this moment three ways of looking at legal thought. One, law is a self-contained system with values which came into it. We don't know how, we don't touch it, we simply make it consistent or coherent. Law and, which says, look to some outside discipline, and from there, in relation to it, move the law. The third one, don't do any of those things. Look just to who is best suited to decide. Now, my fourth approach to legal thought is at a different order of generality. It takes each of these first three, but looks at it from the particular standpoint of a special group, and says, when you look at it through the prism of that group, does it look the same way as it looked like before? Now, I've written an article in Stanford which goes through this and does it with respect to a rather dramatic issue of do we own our body parts? Do we own our blood, our bone marrow, our semen, our ova, our kidneys, or does the person who needs them own them? Do you own your hair, or do I, who clearly needs it, owns it, or whatever? I'd rather hers than yours, thank you very much. And you can look at how this question is asked in the traditional way, which just says, well, how do the legal rules treat ownership of bodies? And by and large, people say, oh yes, you own your own body, it's not the person who needs it, in a formalistic way. You look at it from law and it's very different depending on which and you do and which sub-and you do. If you do law and philosophy, and you look at it from a Kantian point of view, no, you can't use somebody else. If you look at it from a Christian, original, or Marxist point of view, from each according to his ability, to each according to the need. Very different. If you look at it from a Rawlsian point of view, what would we say behind the veil about whether my kidney or my bone marrow or my hair or my blood should be mine or should belong to somebody else? Totally different from the point of view of the formalist. Law and economics does the same thing, but looked at from the standpoint of economics. It says, we have too many kidneys. It's inefficient for each of us to have 2 kidneys and have somebody not have one. Then somebody says, yes, but if you can always get somebody else's kidney, then you won't take care of your kidney. So the incentives are wrong if you give the kidney to the person who needs it. And then somebody else says something else. And you see where that goes. In a way, what law and economics does is very different from what law and philosophy and each of the sub-schools do. But that in itself, though very different from what they do, is all the same sort of analysis, in contrast with a formalistic one, which is really different. It doesn't look good. Now contrast that with legal process, which says, who ought to decide whether the bone marrow of a kidney belongs to the person who needs it or the person who wants it? Is a legislature good at it? Or are we likely to be discriminating in favor of majorities? Can courts do this better? Do we need a lot of detailed knowledge which only an administrative agency can do? And so on and so forth. Again, various schools will decide that differently, but they all will work in the same way in contrast with each of the law ands and with the formalistic. Now for a moment, look at the fourth way, and which says, look at it from the standpoint of a particular group. In the 19th century, it was law and the elite, law and the elect. In the 20th century, it's been various groups, almost never law and the poor, interestingly. Law and the working man, I use man during the New Deal, but almost never. But look at it from the standpoint of race in the law, or women in the law. All of a sudden, the question of, formalistically, do you own your body, or does the person who want it or need it own it, looks completely different. If you're black and in America, you didn't own your body. So what was answered very simply, formalistically, of course you own your own body. It's a very different answer when you look at it from that person. If you're a woman, do you own your body? Did you own your body? Very different answer in terms of each of these different things, which is why we're doing. Okay, all that's an interesting topic, but isn't today's topic. Today's topic is law and economics. So law of economics is one subhead of these. And why did it become so important? Why did it become so important? Well, let me just say in one thing, it's becoming very important early on, and I'll come back to this various times. The law and movement was something that the legal realists, and I've had more to say about them, were very involved in. The greatest of the legal realists was a man at Yale named Arthur Corbin. Contracts, other things. When he was very old, he wrote a letter, which I happen to have, to the faculty, saying, "You are right to be skeptical of law as a formal system. Because who knows where these values came from? And therefore, you went to various law and things," which he was one of the leaders of, "as a place to move the law. But be just as skeptical of each of these ands, whether it is economics, philosophy, literature, or what have you. They know it, they have the answers no more than law does. Use them, but be skeptical of them as well." Wonderful and forgotten by all too many people. Okay, so what is the origin of law and economics? Well, I said that Bentham and Mill, in a way, were doing this in the 19th century. Bentham didn't call it economics, but his utilitarianism was closely related to it. And Mill did it in a very different, John Stuart Mill, in a very different way. And I'll have more to say about them later, especially when I talk about the difference between economic analysis of law and law and economics. In the early 20th century, there was a good deal of work done that is properly viewed as law and economics work. But what it was primarily work in areas of law that specifically linked themselves to economics. That is, the law itself made reference to an economic concept. So it was not difficult for people working in those areas of law to say, the law, even as a coherent system, has asked us to look to this, and therefore we look at it. That happened in antitrust law, where some people said that one of the references in anti-monopoly law was to economic efficiency. Maybe not the only one, I don't think the only one, but one of them was to that. So you have to look at economics. Another one was taxation, which interestingly then, law and economics more recently has had very little to do with, but taxation early had some references specifically to economics. And so people like Seligman at the beginning of the 20th century did some law and economics work of that sort. This was done both at Yale and at Chicago, which is one reason why Chicago claims, quite incorrectly I think, to have been there before anybody else, because they weren't. They were just one of several. But they're rather imperialistic for reasons which will come through. Then came the legal realist, beginning with Hofeld, Hound, and Corbin at the beginning of the 20th century, who were looking for a place to stand on to change the law. And they did law and society, social studies, generally. They did it with sociology, they did it with philosophy, and they did it also with some rather sloppy economics. Now, I say sloppy economics, although if you go back far enough, you find an extraordinary thing at Yale, that in the 19th century, teaching in the law school and required for all law students was a course in economics by William Graham Sumner, the founder of sociology, and a remarkable scholar who taught that, because Yale, for odd reasons which go back in something else, was always law and, when other schools were instead formalistic. Back at the very beginning, for some strange reasons, which you find, it's been found out much more now. And he was pretty good. But these people looked to any number of different things, occasionally also to economics. But economics was not their primary thing. It was a place to stand on that was their primary thing. Among the works of law and economics of this time is one very bad article by William O. Douglas, who was a brilliant man who went on to the Supreme Court, who wrote an article on torts, where he got most of his economics wrong, but it's kind of fun because it tries to do what maybe one should do. Okay. The next thing that happens, and this instead is really important for what developed, was that among economists, there were some economists who felt left out by economics. Economics was becoming more mathematical, more rigid, and some economists who called themselves institutionalists and who were much more empirically based and looked at the world as it was, found themselves uncomfortable in economics departments. One of them was a man named Ronald Coase, who at the time, in the 1920s, was a socialist. You'd never know it now. He's 100, he's a libertarian. But when you're 100, you can be a libertarian. I don't know. Free market to heaven, maybe, I don't know. Whatever. But at the time, he was a socialist. And he wrote an extraordinarily important article, which got ignored until he had become a libertarian, and he wrote the same article from the point of view of libertarianism, which immediately got picked up. It was called The Nature of the Firm. At the same time, an economist named Walton Hamilton, who was again an institutional economist, and was unhappy in the economics department, came to the Yale Law School and started teaching there and became a professor there. Walton Hamilton put together some materials on torts with a man named Schulman, which were going to be the torts course. Then Walton Hamilton got interested in antitrust law and left that and never taught torts. He ultimately became a professor of antitrust law, and when he retired, some of his students, having become leading lawyers in Washington, Arnold, Fortas, and Porter, big firm there, from an Arnold, Fortas, who went on the Supreme Court, and Porter, wanted him to join them in the firm, and they somehow, though he never had a law degree, got him admitted by statute, and he became a great lawyer, and that was the end of that. I just learned of this recently because the torts materials that I studied torts with were Schulman and James, and Fleming James, who was my teacher, knew no economics, but put together from the original materials of Hamilton and Schulman. So that, in fact, Coase, the institutionalist, doing his writing, and Hamilton, the institutionalist, putting together these materials, turned out to be the source of the new law and economics movement of the 50s and 60s. What happened was that at that point, Coase wrote an article, The Problem of Social Cost, in which he said the same thing he had said about in the nature of the firm, but basically what he did was to apply economics now to areas of law that were not expressly economic and see what happened to torts, property. At the same time, a little Turk, Calabresi, who had studied economics, went to law school, looked at these materials in torts, accident law, in which there were all sorts of questions that his teacher said, we don't know why it is so, or we don't know what is going on, which the materials asked and which were questions that were straight economic questions. Why were they? Because Walton Hamilton had put them there, that they hadn't bothered to do anything with them. So I look at them and I say, you know, as to some of these, the answer is perfectly obvious if you look at it from an economic point of view, like master-servant liability, respondeat superior. The answer to that is absolutely easy if you look at it from economics, even though the rubric in torts was, it exists in every legal system, but we don't know why. And the answer is, we don't know why. It's perfectly obvious if you look at it from an economics point of view. And there were other things instead, where looking at it that way raised more questions. And this is important, that it was not only that it gave answers, but it also raised questions. The result was that in 1956, I wrote the first draft of the article that came out in 1960. The time I wrote it, the editors of the Yale Law Journal didn't like it. They made me an officer, but they didn't like it because they didn't understand it, which is a piece of great luck, because if I'd published it as a student piece, it probably would have gotten lost. Instead, I published it when I came back to teaching in 1959-60. Coase published his thing slightly after, but independently, and together it said, hey, look what happens if you use economics and law together in areas which are very different from those straightly linked areas like antitrust or tax. Well, this caused something of a fuss. And let's say right now that the way Coase and I wrote, there were things that economics explained, there were things that economics did not explain, but neither Coase nor I tended to say the things that economics does not explain are irrational behaviors, things that are silly, that people should not do. Both Coase and I said, where that happens, maybe economic theory is not nuanced enough, complicated enough to deal with it. And that's a very important difference. Let's stop here for a moment and say that when I wrote and Coase wrote, there was immediately a big debate, and now, strangely, many of the articles from that original debate, before I published The Cost of Accidents in 1970, that is from 1960 to 1970, those debates have tended to disappear from the discussion. I kind of know why. But it's worth going back and looking at the criticism of law and economics that Blum and Calvin made at the time, conservative, but actually very much like the critics did later, in some way. So those things were kind of there and have gotten lost. At the time, the thing caused something of a scandal. What was this thing that these people were doing? And it can't be right. A scandal, to some extent in the United States, although It got me promoted at the age of 12, so I became a professor before any of you were even born, or your parents were, which was lucky for me. But it still, many places just didn't even think about it. Harvard didn't even think it existed, and so on. And in Europe, even more. In 1965, as I love to tell the story, I went to the Max Planck because the people there had heard about my work. I already was a tenured professor at Yale, though I was a kid. And I went to the Max Planck and I presented my stuff. And the head of the Max Planck, who was kind of a god of German law, said, when I finished, "That is very interesting, Calabresi. But you must understand, it is not law and it is not legal scholarship." And I, like any good Italian, I was skeptical of Germans. And in any case, I had my chair, and I couldn't care less about the Max Planck. Said, it may not be so now, but it soon will be. And at that point, the two people on either side of here started to laugh. And the head of the Max Planck, looking like any good Herr Professor, looked fiercely at them, and they each stopped in mid-laughter. But each of them became head of the Max Planck. And what happened was not only that this has become law and legal scholarship, but there are fools who think it is the only thing that is law and legal scholarship. There were two reasons why this offended classic European scholarship. One of them, that this was a break from law as a formal system. And they would have made the same criticism of law and philosophy, law and history, and everything else, that law should not get into the social sciences. And, you know, as I say, that's one of four approaches to law. I like to use them all. I've used them all. As a judge, I use them all. And look at it from the standpoint of law and gender, or law, you know, I do every one of those things because they are all useful at different times. But the other reason is a more important reason, because it's a wrong reason, but it derives from the type of law and economic scholarship that Coase and I did at the beginning, and that as a result, others followed with. Because we were writing in America, we tended to write to address our law and economic scholarship to courts, and to say, look, here is why you are doing master-servant liability. Understand it and use it. Or here is a problem, courts, think about it in developing the law. To a European, this was anathema, not just because it went outside of formalistic law, but because it seemed to address law change to courts. And in European systems, courts have a much smaller role in lawmaking than in an American system. I don't mean to exaggerate how much American courts make law. As a judge, I know that we make law far less than people think, especially intermediate courts, federal courts, and so on. But there are many areas, like torts law, which is where I was writing and Coase was writing, where courts were delegated the authority. In the United States, courts were delegated that authority at the very beginning, after independence. Every state delegated the common law's development to the courts. So courts were instructed to do that. So it was perfectly understandable to write to them in that area. But that doesn't mean that what we were doing wasn't equally relevant for Europe, but just addressed to a different body. Instead of addressing the analysis, the possibilities of reform to courts in Europe, in South America, and most countries where courts do not have the power that American, and to some extent English courts do, the address should be to the powers that have the authority to make law. And that doesn't make the scholarship irrelevant. It means that you have to translate what we were writing into something which is relevant to the institutional lawmaking structure of a different country. And that is what has been beginning to happen, which is why law and economics has picked up much more in the world outside the United States, as people have, one, gotten away from formalistic law as the only way, and two, understood that this has to be made part of a broader approach to lawmaking, not just focused on the courts. Okay. This gets us to 1970, and when my first articles and some other things get put together in a book called The Cost of Accidents. The importance of that date is, one, that since my articles and some others got put together in The Cost of Accidents, people stopped looking at what was said before, which is kind of too bad, because they look always to the cost of accidents and sat down. But two, that there were reviews, articles written of the cost of accidents. One of them, extraordinary, by Frank Michelman at Harvard, did exactly what law and should do, and led me then to write the article on the cathedral and torts as a law of the ideologically mixed society, about which more this afternoon. The other one was by one young scholar named Richard Posner. Posner began his review of the cost of accidents in a rather dramatic way. He said, I am not a torts scholar, which is what the book was about, accidents, right? But in a way, neither is Calabresi. But think of that. Why not Calabresi? Because he's talking economics. That's the world back in 1970, even Posner. But then Posner gets excited and looks into this and buys into part of it, but only part of it, and becomes the fanatic follower who goes off in his own direction. What Posner did, which was extraordinarily important, was to change law and economics into economic analysis of law. What does that mean? What he did was to say, what is exciting about this is that you look at all of law, not just economically linked law, but everything in law from the viewpoint of this place to stand on, economic theory. You analyze law from an economic point of view, economic analysis of law. Now, he changed the words and nobody noticed. Because we didn't have words. We didn't say law and economics, we didn't say anything. And if the law did not fit economics, he and others of that approach said the law, the real world, because the law represents what really happens in the world, the institutions of the world, are wrong, are irrational, should be changed. Economics becomes not just a place to stand on from which you learn something and talk back and forth. It becomes the queen of the sciences and law her handmaiden. You look at law from an economic point of view and say, does the world make sense? And if it doesn't, you change it, or you criticize it. Now there's something very interesting here, because it immediately negates the statement that economists make that they are not interested in values and can say nothing about values. Because this immediately says the values that are inherent in economic theory are the right values. And that's a mighty dramatic statement about values. One of the things I will be writing on is what economists say about values while denying they are saying it, and what they could instead say about values, which would be very useful, which I think one can. And that may be the most important thing of this series of essays that I will be doing at my age. Anyway, this becomes what Posner and his followers do in every area of law. You take economics, it's a machine, you put whatever there is in it, you grind it out, and sausages come out. Put in sausages. Now, the more the real world is linked to economic values, the more sensible this approach can be. The further away you get, the more likely you are to have problems. But it doesn't matter. That's what you do. Now, let me say, to Posner's credit, he did that as a scholar and continues to do it as a scholar in a way that is, frankly, at a certain point rather boring, of just churning it into the machine, using existing economic theory, analyzing law, and doing that. As a judge, he doesn't do that quite so much. As a judge, he's smart enough so that as a judge he has to look at the real world. And the real world is there, and he sometimes criticizes, refuses to do things because of economic theory. But other times, Posner won't do that as a judge. Which is why I've written him and said, look, Richard, you're a great scholar, but you're a much better judge because you don't fall into your silly trap. There are others instead, even judges like Frank Easterbrook of the same court, and Posner and he often disagree, interestingly, who instead does the same thing even as a judge. Now, why has that become so important? One, because unlike each of the other law ends, economics, in economic theory, looks rigorous, looks firm, not fuzzy. And that means it can be used easily, and that mistakes in using it can be criticized or could be avoided, and so it can be reproduced easily. Because you could do the same thing with law and philosophy, law and bananas, law and anything else. That's the machine you put in it. But it doesn't work as well because those others are not as rigorous as law and economics. Second, and this is also very important, the economic theory that they used, that Posner and the others used, was a particular sort. It was Chicago School, Viennese-derived, libertarian market-oriented, marginalist economic theory. It was the dominant theory in some ways. And it was there, and that's the economic theory that they used as a place to stand on to criticize the law. There are several advantages to using that theory, which have made it so popular. One, it is very conservative, very right-wing. And that means that it got lots of money. For research, and other things. It was very easy to find people who would support it. Coase's first article was ignored. Coase's article, The Problem of Social Cost, got picked up in part because there were people who liked what they thought it said. I don't think Coase was actually saying it. But they certainly liked this particular approach. The other thing is, Chicago-style economic theory, Viennese, marginalist, is very easy. Even when it gets mathematical, it is easy. It is not difficult for somebody who is a would-be legal scholar to master it enough so that they can take this machine and apply it to an area of law where it has not been applied. Law on bananas, law on sugar coating, law on this, law on that. And that means that any number of people who want to have academic careers and want to get tenure and want to write articles can produce relatively easy articles which you can say are new because they apply this machine in another area very easy. And that means that it can be done a lot. And that is what happened. So that you get a mass of stuff. Some of it moderately interesting, some of it less so. All of it, after all, is not particularly, it uses a certain amount of paper, but it's not that bad. It's used that amount of paper, and fine. And it gets churned out in great quantities. Now, understand that there is no reason why economic analysis of law must begin the analysis from the standpoint of Chicago libertarian Viennese marginalist economic theory. And there are plenty of people around in the United States who do economic analysis of law, not from that point of view, but from some other, somewhat more complex economic theories. Henry Hansman, Susan Rose Ackerman, Ian Ayres, all three happen to be at Yale, but there are people all over who do the same thing. They take economic theory, but an economic theory which is broader, takes into account distributional issues, is somewhat more complex, and then analyze law in that way. You could go even, now that is done, it's not as easy to do because the results are not as clear, it's not as clean, it's not as narrow and easy to do. So while their scholarship is, from my point of view, often much more interesting, it still is economic analysis of law in this sense, and it isn't as broadly used. The new kid who just wants to write something generally churns out something out of Chicago. Now, there is nothing that says that when you do this economic analysis of law, you have to do a kind of social democratic economic theory like Ayres or Hansman or Chicago. You could do exactly the same thing using Marxist economic theory or any other economic theory. Economic analysis of law simply takes a place to stand on and tests the legal world from that point of view. And that place to stand on doesn't need to be Chicago, it can be Marx. In the same way that if you do law and philosophy, you don't need to be a Kantian. You can be a Marxist or an early Christian, or you can be a Rawlsian, as your case is standing. It's interesting that very few people have done Marxist economic analysis of law. recently. It would be kind of interesting to see what it turned up. I would still criticize it because it would still be someone taking this theory and saying that is the truth. We look at law in its light, which is what I object to. And by the way, what Corbyn, in his farewell letter, told us to be wary of. Don't take that truth as being so. So what is the difference between that and law and economics? Law and economics, as I did it, I've done some economic analysis of law too sometimes, but as I did it, as Coase did it, and as I am proposing to do in the lecture tomorrow and in the work that I am doing, says, okay, take an economic theory, whichever one, look at the law and see what it says. But the law and the lawyer are institutionalists. We are people who look at the world as it is. If economic theory, whichever one you are using, does not explain the world as it is, instead of saying the world is irrational, the world makes no sense, change it, we say, is economic theory sophisticated enough, or has it made assumptions for its own convenience that render it less useful? Can we change economic theory in the light of the world and then use that more sophisticated economic theory to look back at this part of the world and maybe to look at any other number of things which people did not look at? That is what Coase did in the famous article, The Nature of the Firm. He said, economists say markets are costless. That was the dominant thing in economic theory. If markets were costless, there would be no firms. Why? Because firms are command structures rather than market structures. And we would do everything which we do by firms, by contract, by market. But there are firms. They're all over the place. Is it necessary for economic theory to say that markets are costless? Well, why should we say markets are costless? It's handy, but let's say markets cost something. It then helps explain why there are firms, when they are, why they are, and so on. But from that, you also get an economic theory which is far more complicated, far more nuanced, which helped explain any number of other things, which is why Coase well deserved his Nobel Prize. Not just because of what he said about firms, but what he did to economic theory, which made it work better in any number of other ways. Law in economics is a two-way street. Law describes to the economist the real world. The economist, looking at it from whatever economic theory says, sometimes, oh, well, I understand. Other times says, I don't, I can't. And law says, let's see if we change you a bit, rather than saying that what happens is irrational, when you can then explain, and then we look at this broader economic theory shaped by the institutionalists and see what it can tell us.
Can I ask you a question? Didn't they, in fact, change the word? I mean, in a way, by saying, the word is irrational, it doesn't work, their theory picked up by the strong
what
economic.
they're trying to do is change
They actually,
yeah, of
they
course.
actually
by saying the world is irrational, they are trying to change the world to fit economic theory. And that's what they did in antitrust, and that's what they've done in economics. Now, there are plenty of times when people resist. When they did it with law and family and law and children, people said, oh, you're crazy. Posner as judge resists what Posner as scholar would have him do. Easterbrook has said, no, so very often they do. But that's why
no, but even more broadly than that, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but even more broadly than that, in a way, they contributed enormously to structuring the ideology of the last 30 years that, you know, makes the law.
Of course,
yeah.
you can, but if you take the world as being what economics says it should be, you then try to change that world at a narrow level or at the broadest level in order to do it. That's your place to stand now, and you change everything. And Portman says you're silly, but there it is. And that's been the success of Chicago. If instead it's a two-way street, the thing becomes far more interesting and quite dramatic. Now, let me say that this difference between economic analysis of law, which is still being done all the time. I mean, at Harvard, Chavelle, Kaplow, at Stanford, Polinsky, that's what they do all the time. And they do it rather well, as against some of the, you know, people who don't do it that well. But it still is a terribly limited way of looking at it. Economic analysis of law and law and economics as two ways of looking at things go back a long way. Let's go back to Bentham and Mill. Mill asked who were the seminal minds of the century, from 1750 to 1850, said Coleridge, the poet, interesting that he should have said Coleridge, and Bentham. And then he said of Bentham, he approached all ideas as a stranger, and if they did not fit his theory, he dismissed them as vague generalities. This is straight economic analysis of law. Bentham looks at the world from a utilitarian point of view, that is his place to stand on. The world doesn't fit. Nonsense. Nonsense on stilts, he says, changing in the way you say. Mill, wiser than Bentham, clever as Brighton, says what he did not realize was that in those vague generalities lay the whole unanalyzed wisdom and experience of the human race. That in what this place to stand on does not explain is the wisdom and experience of people, the world as it really is. And therefore, we have to change the theory in the light. Now, Mill is wise enough to say, yes, but sometimes the experience, what is there in the real world, is ideas that are no longer good, exploitation by people in power. That's why we do this game, because we don't want the law to be a self-contained system, conservative and serving the past. But we can't simply, from the standpoint of any theory, whether it is utilitarian or economic Chicago or Marxist, simply say, that is the truth, we change the world to fit. Now, what are some things which, if you look at from a law and economics point of view, are not explained by economic theory today? And these are the things that I am working on, and then I'll stop and just take questions generally. One of them is altruism, beneficence. If you look at economic theory, they ask whether it is more efficient to furnish some services through self-interest or beneficence, altruistic arrangements, not for profits. And when they look at it, they almost always find it is more efficient to get from here to there through self-interest. And therefore they say, beneficence, altruism, not-for-profits, nonsense, nonsense on stilts. The lawyer economist said, but we do have a lot of altruism. We do have a lot of not-for-profits. Is there something wrong with economic theory so that it can be made broader and deal with it? I've worked enough on that so I can tell you, and if you want, we can talk about it in question and answer. The answer is of course. And if you just change economic theory a little bit, the proliferation of beneficence, altruism, not-for-profit can easily be explained, and that will change economic theory much for the better. Another is shaping of tastes. Law, the real world, is constantly concerned with shaping values. That's what the critics said, and then they didn't say anything else about it. You know, they said shaping values is important, and then they walked away. The economists say economic theory has nothing to say about shaping values. The lawyer economist says, let's look at it. And can economic theory be moderated in a way so that it can tell us something about shaping values? And the answer to that also is absolutely. And very interesting things, rather surprising. Another thing is the constant dominance of distributional thinking. Classic economic theory says treat distribution as a question you decide first. What level of inequality we want, and then decide individual cases, never considering distribution. Any lawyer knows that half of tort law is concerned with favoring the poor, favoring the rich, favoring this group, favoring that group. Distributional issues are all over the law. If it is so wrong in terms of economic theory, why does it prevail? Well, the answer is that economic theory doesn't explain what is going on adequately. And again, that's another part. The last one is what I'll be talking about tomorrow, is why are there goods which we sometimes have called merit goods that we don't allocate in a market way normally? What are they? They're there. Economic theory does not explain them. But it could, if we just broaden the economic theory and then see what happens with this broader economic theory. There's nothing new about the difference between economic analysis of law and law and economics. I say it goes back to Bentham and Mill. 30 years ago, the syllabus at Cambridge University in welfare economics, put together by a man I don't know who he is, I don't know if he's alive, I don't know what's become of him, had assigned, as I learned by chance, some writings by Posner and some writings by him. And it said, the difference between Posner and Calabresi is that Posner takes economics as a given and analyzes law on the basis of it and criticizes it and changes the world on the basis of economics. Calabresi looks at economics but also looks at law, uses law to change economics and make the thing a two-way street. He didn't call it law and economics as against economic analysis of law, but this guy who was teaching welfare economics understood. That's the challenge. It is so easy for you when you go out to take economic theory, whichever one you like, and simply apply it to law, and say that's the way the law world ought to be. It's easy, but it's very limiting. The challenge instead is to be what lawyers are, institutionalists, people of the world, and ask, does whatever economic theory I am comfortable with explain this? And if it doesn't, can we change it? Can we move it back and forth? Is it nonsense on stilts, or is it the unanalyzed wisdom and experience of the human race? Questions of any sort, and if you want, to talk about things, it's now. We have, what is that, 45 minutes, which is whatever. Then I got lunch and pull myself together, talk about the same thing in a different way this afternoon. And as I said, we can talk also about altruism, about shaping taste, if you want any of those things. Or, yes, sir. Tell me who you are, because one of the glories of this place, despite its name, Yoke, it's not Yoke. It's wonderful. Is people come from all over, as I learned. You're from St. Hughes?
No, I'm actually Italian. My name is Guido, and I'm Italian.
You're Italian?
Yeah.
Well, we'll let you speak English anyway.
Right.
But you have to all speak loud, because I don't hear well.
Okay. So my question is, you say let's change economics by looking at the law. To what extent what you then get as being economics is not a more general social theory which bridges into sociology and...
Well, and that's a very important question. To what extent do you then get a different law and that looks at other things than economics, and to what extent you get a different economics? And that may be a purely verbal thing, or it may not. We have an example of that now. One of the popular schools today is behavioral economics. What happened there, actually, was really a subcategory of law and economics. That some people said there are things in the world that are not explained. Let's change economic theory and see what happens. And you have this small thing which has become the fad of the day, which is behavioral economics, and economists are perfectly happy to treat that as economics and then to do the analysis. When Coase said markets are costly, command is costly, let's see what costs more, economic theory was perfectly willing to accept that, able to accept it within its system without losing its rigor, and it's so proud of, and use it. Some of the things that the world may look at, the lawyer may look at, would require changes that, frankly, economic theory probably won't be able to. Because it would ask of economics to become sufficiently less rigorous that economists just won't be happy with it. To the extent that that is so, then the world is not going to change economics. It's going to have to say, economics can't explain this fully because its limits keep it from doing it. We have to do law and economic sociology. But understand that the more you move into that way of doing it, the less likely you are to find adherence. Just from a practical point of view. because it's difficult enough to do interdisciplinary work between one discipline and another. It's harder to do what ultimately a lawyer really does need to do, which is to do law and everything. Law and economics, law and sociology. In Tragic Choices, in my book with Philip Bobbitt, at the end I say, there are many things which I think a more nuanced economics can help us to explain about how people assign child rights, how societies assign the right to have children, the right to get kidney transplants, the right to serve in the military and things like that. There are many things that I think economics can deal with. There are some things about what is actually done that I don't think can be explained in terms of an economic theory that I can think of. Now, it may be my limits of what I can do in economics. I think it is more in the realm of anthropology. And I suggest in the book that maybe a law and anthropology criticism development would be useful. I can't tell you where to draw the line. At the moment, our leader here has asked me to talk about the history of law and economics, so I'm talking about changes that can be made in economics and so on. But in the end, like Arthur Corbin, I will always be skeptical of even what the more nuanced economic theory will tell me. And at that point, I'll want to see what some other law and things can shed light. And strange ones. I'll want to read Shakespeare and see how certain things that come up in law, that even my more nuanced law and economic things, are treated in the great canonic literature, down to how it bequeaths them, and how that is explained. Because that will shed some knowledge about things of a different sort. You know, people often say, just absurd, people often say, oh, books, television, words don't hurt. Which is why we allow them. First Amendment. You know, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, break my bones, but words will never hurt. No, if people use pornography or rape things or violence, it doesn't matter. We say that. Sometimes we say it for the best of reasons because we want people to be able to say anything because we don't trust people to stop, which is the way I feel. I'm very First Amendment strong. But if you go back to Dante, you see that Paolo and Francesca were reading a French novel. And it's that caused them to go to bed with each other. And end up being in bed. Words have effects. If you look at some law and things, and you know it from way back. That doesn't mean that we want to stop the words. But it gives us an insight into it, which is why I say, don't. With Corbin, I say, look at all of them and then be skeptical. Good. Because if you don't ask questions, I'll start asking you questions.
Yeah, my name is Tanya. I'm from Uzbekistan, and I'm more grateful to be employed and economics from the both perspective, not because I'm from Chicago School, but because I think that his concept does make sense. And when we look at economics and then apply it to the legal analysis, to the legal, some legal issues, it makes more sense and easier, not that much complicated, rather than we are trying to understand the life as it is using first law and then adjusting the economics to the real world. Because from the economics perspective, like when we make 1 + 1 is always 2. But when we take a law, pure law, 1 + 1 never, well, sometimes it's 2, sometimes
Well,
3, sometimes
it
it's 10.
depends on how you do it. And I'd like to use a moment the example I talked about altruism. Because I think this is an example, just as for Coase, the question of are markets costless. You know, after our markets costless comes in, 1 + 1 still makes 2 with Coase, just as much. And there's nothing that Coase did that destroyed economic theory. Now, let's look at altruism. Economics always looks at beneficence, altruism, in terms of whether it is an efficient way of going from here to here, of structuring education, of giving medical services. Is it more efficient to have for-profit incentives? And they say, no, it's more efficient to have incentives. The answer is, the question then is, why do we have so much beneficent institutions, not-for-profit institutions? Well, when you start to think about it, you ask yourself, why do they look at altruism only as a means, as a way of getting from here to here? Why don't they look at altruism, beneficence, as something we like? Something in our utility functions, to use the most Chicago economic thing, something we want more of. It's silly to say that it is expensive to get from here to here by altruism, if altruism isn't there to get from here to here, but it's something we like. It's as silly to ask, is it more expensive to have an altruistic institution or a self-interested institution? It's as silly as to say, is it cheaper to feed oneself on potatoes than on caviar? Of course it's cheaper to eat potatoes, but if I like caviar, why shouldn't I have caviar? Is it cheaper to defirst myself on water or on champagne? Well, of course it's cheaper on water. But if I like champagne, why can't I have champagne in my world? Is it cheaper to reproduce ourselves through sex or through sperm banks the way we do with bulls? Well, of course it would be much cheaper to use sperm banks, but it's more fun to make love. So we do that, oh, it is expensive. Then you ask yourself, why don't economists look at altruism as something which we want? Now, there's nothing in economics in itself that says that shouldn't be in our utility functions. Economics has no more right to say that wanting beneficence, altruism, is something that ought not to be in our utility function, then it has a right to say caviar, champagne, or sex is in our utility function. That is economics taking a stand on values without any basis. So then you ask yourself, why does economics do that? And that's where it gets interesting. That's where law and starts to broaden economics. Because the reason economics does that is something very strange about altruism. I call it McKeon's paradox because it's associated with an economist named McKeon at Virginia long dead, who said, it is meaningless to say, how much must I pay you to love me for myself alone? If I try to buy altruism in the market, if I try to buy your beneficence by paying you, I destroy it. Unlike caviar, unlike sex, wait a second, but unlike caviar or champagne, if I pay, I destroy the good. So the market, pure market, won't work. But not only pure market won't work to optimize the amount of altruism, but neither will pure command. It's as meaningless to say, how can I force you to love me for myself alone? That destroys the good too. The economist, not able to use the traditional economic ways of market and command to optimize the allocation of this resource, altruism, acts as if it isn't there. And it's perfectly normal for a human being. If it doesn't work easily, just put it aside. But the moment you put the question this way, you then take another step and you say, that's true. I can't buy beneficence without destroying it with a pure market. But candy helps. Gifts help. There are any number of semi-market ways in which I can increase people's loving me for myself alone. And if I can't command you to love me, or to be altruistic, education, which is a mighty powerful semi-command, can do it without destroying the good. All of a sudden, we see not just what the problem of altruism was, but what the advantages would be if economics looked not just at pure markets and pure command, but at modified markets and modified commands, and looked at how it would then optimize the allocation of resources. And that's a mighty powerful change which economics can handle. And in fact, as we'll see tomorrow, has handled in certain particular ways at certain particular times. That change becomes a way of staying with economics, but now asking all sorts of very interesting questions about what do you do if you don't think of either market and command as unitary and simple things, but more complex. And by the way, at that point, you go back, or I go back to Coase and the nature of the firm. He said, markets are costly. That's why we have a command structure, the firm. And he left it at that. But isn't it interesting that the command structure that we have in firms is a command structure, but it isn't the command structure which typically economists in their paradigms think of as command. Command to the economist is the government. That's the command, that's the pure command, just as a pure market is over here. Coase, without really even thinking about it, was describing a modified command structure that is a private command structure in the firm, which he found to be very prevalent. The moment you start thinking about modified markets and modified command, you start understanding better even some things we thought we understood going back to Coase. So that's why I think it's worthwhile. Now, I don't mean the other doesn't have its own utility, but cheapers, I at least think this is fun. And useful. And useful.
There's a question.
Could you explain something? You were just mentioning,
I'm sorry?
you were just mentioning Coase and the firm. And I know that Coase said at some point the state is one market actor. Could you explain that in
mean, is this a kind of normative statement in the sense that the state should be one among many market actors?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what Coase meant when he said that. I think that what he was saying was something along the lines that you don't treat the state as an entirely separate unit. You don't treat command by the state as something which is sui generis and different. The state can command, the state can make markets, can pay for things. If you start looking at the state in that way, you're immediately in this world of mixed command and other things. And I think that when Coase said that, he was, as so often is the case with Coase, because he doesn't write much, but is profoundly empirical institutionalist, kind of stating an intuition about the world as he sees it. One wishes that he would write more thoroughly about some of these. I think that's what he's doing. But of course, I may be leading him to be saying what I am now saying about mixed markets and other things.
I just mentioned because, I mean, of course, Coase, I mean, it sounds like from the narrative that you told today, that Coase in some ways was misappropriated, or the whole law and econ
Was misappropriated?
Misappropriated the sense of Posner and the law and econ,
Well,
economic analysis of law.
Anybody. I'm a great believer in products liability. You put a product on the market, if people use it, and they use it as they wish, and if they then end up making mistakes with it, it's still your fault. So if I write something and somebody misunderstands it, it's not my fault, perhaps not fault, but I'm liable for it. And so Coase did that, and I think there is no doubt that the economic analysis of law people had used one part of Coase for their own and have used it very successfully that way. There is a rather sad story, not sad, trivial. My first article, thoughts on risk distribution and the law of toleraance. This article that was independent of Coase and came out slightly before Coase, originally had in it a discussion of the symmetry of causation, which is one of the major things that Coase did in his problem of social cause. That is, it had a discussion of why it made no sense from a causation point of view to say that a car caused the injury to a pedestrian rather than a pedestrian caused the injury when a car and a pedestrian hit. From a purely theoretical point of view, it takes two to tango. You need both. And who you want to put the cost on is a different question, and a very important question, but it isn't answered by saying it is cars that hit people rather than people who are hit cars, in that it takes two. And that's his rejection of Pigou. And I had, and it was in some ways the most controversial part of Coase. I had a long discussion in my first article, which came out the same way Coase did, of saying, in theory, it is completely symmetrical. I showed this when I wrote it as a student piece to an economist who was on the faculty at Yale, and he said, that's wrong. And I said, it's not wrong. And he said, it is wrong. And I said, why do you say it's wrong? And he said, Pigou. And as I know Pigou, and it doesn't make any sense. And he said, well, everybody will say it's wrong. This is a wonderful article. You will get great praises for it. Don't put this in, it will just make trouble. If you want to write about that later, write about it later, but don't put it in now. The only time in my life I ever followed anybody's advice in what I wrote was to follow his advice, and I took it out. I did leave a footnote that is there, which without discussion says, I don't understand why we say when there is a pedestrian automobile accident that it is the automobile hitting the pedestrian rather than the pedestrian hitting the automobile, but I don't need to discuss it in this piece, so I won't. Coase instead said the same thing. And he went and presented his paper, he was then in Virginia, at Chicago. And everybody at Chicago said, you're wrong. Stiegler, Schmiegler, Biegler, Fliegler, Friedman, Schmiedman, director, Schmirector, they all said you're wrong. Coase, was by then in his 50s, and a senior professor, and said, I'm not wrong. And they said, you're wrong, Pigou. I said, I know Pigou, same thing. But Coase insisted, left it in, and of course was right. I say this not because, what difference does it make whether my analysis was there at the same time or not? Coase did any number of other things, and every honor he got he deserves. Had my piece come out with that, since I, at the time especially, was very left-centered, the Coase theorem would not have been viewed, could not have been viewed as a right-wing trick. It could not have been grabbed by the economic analysis of law people as they did, because the same theorem would have been presented in a context that instead asked for interventionism, social democracy, and left things. And that would have both saved a lot of time and would have avoided the problem that you're speaking of. So it was too bad that I followed what that economist did. By now one should know better. Coase, as a theorem, is a wonderfully useful piece of analysis that doesn't belong to the right or to the left, or to economic analysis of law as against law and economics, any more than anything else. In the end, the Coase theorem, and it's kind of interesting to say what the Coase theorem was. Symmetry of causation, and if there are no transaction costs, we always reach an efficient solution. That's what, in essence, it is. Coase's theorem is identical in microeconomics to what Say's law was in macroeconomics. Say's law, which you may not know about, was the dominant theory in macroeconomics, and it said total demand must always equal total supply. And he demonstrated it totally. Until Keynes came along and said, but that doesn't work if there are lags, if there are this and that. What are Keynes's lags? They're transaction costs. They're costs that keep us from doing that. In macroeconomics, Say's law was dominant until Keynes said, but look at all the lags. Because of that, macroeconomics was almost useless until Keynes because the theory said it doesn't matter, so don't bother. Welfare microeconomics, instead, which had the theory wrong, which, like Pigou, didn't talk about without transaction costs, everything can be optimized regardless, made a lot of empirical guesses as to what the transaction costs were, and very often, in policy terms, got it right. You know, Pigou was right that most of the time it is right to put the cost of a polluter rather than of a pollutee. Not because it isn't symmetrical, not because if there weren't transaction costs it wouldn't matter, but because there are transaction costs and so it does matter. Coase comes along and gets the theory right, but by then, of course, there's an awful lot of data that helps us decide real cases correctly. So in an odd way, Coase comes along and tells us, think more carefully about what is going on, but you can never go back, go to a world where it really doesn't matter. Only crazy people, even among the Chicago types, only the craziest say it doesn't matter at all, we don't need to do it.
Yeah.
In fact, early on, a Chicago type deficit says, when do liability rules matter? And started talking about transaction costs and when they don't matter.
Guido, I have a question that I'd like to try with you. You remember the tragedy of the commons model, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And a lot of the behavioral non-economic stuff basically kind of fixes the model in the sense of saying, look, in the real life, people behave in a way that is not profit maximizing on the short term, you know, that is not like the rational behavior model, but it's another thing. And therefore, you know, then Ostrom arrives and therefore, you know, the tragedy of the commons really doesn't work in the real life because blah, 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 okay? So they kind of fix the model, and these old guys, you know, that do the behavioral thing work in the direction of fixing the model to make it more reflective of the reality of life, as you were saying before, okay? Now, let's shift, however, this picture to the behavior of the firm and the behavior of the hierarchical organization of a firm structure. For example, you know, a profit-making corporation. And it seems to me that if that is the model, so if we are not in the domain of how we behave as human beings, capable of love, capable of all sorts of things, but if we think about the behavior of people that are not behaving as flesh and blood human beings, but artificial beings, like the corporation, then the tragedy of the commons hold. And the world is the big commons, you know, and these guys kind of behave in that way.
I think that's a very important insight into one of the problems of what behavioral law and economics is doing today in the hands of some people. It's an insight which is more important even than that. I think that it is a mistake to think that because individuals often prefer not to behave in a profit-maximizing way, and that is not irrational, again, as economists at one point would have said, but simply because it costs too much to take all the costs into account. It destroys altruism. It does all sorts of things which we don't want to do to behave as profit maximizers all the time, which is what these people are saying and properly saying. It's a mistake to say, therefore, the kinds of profit maximization that we analyzed before has no relevance for individuals, and therefore the commons does not apply to individuals. That is an overstatement. Individuals may not behave rationally when you ask them rationally in this economic sense. I think they behave perfectly rationally. They do not behave as profit maximizers in a simplistic, everyday way when they decide whether to choose a ham sandwich or a mozzarella sandwich or something of that sort, or whether they decide whether to go to bed or to have a haircut. But they are frequently given the opportunity to behave in an economically maximizing way and do so. And that, frankly, is what much of my early work on torts was about. I said, yes, insurance means that people don't immediately decide accident costs. On the other hand, the existence of accident costs in insurance means that a car which has certain accident propensities will be more expensive than another one, depending on our system of liability, and you, without having to worry about whether you're an homo economicus or a homo patrimonicus, will buy the cheaper car. And so you will react in a way that responds, in fact, economically. And to go, and that can be shown quite clearly in context. There are areas where it doesn't and areas where it does. That is why the dramatic saying, the common does not exist, problem and reaction does not exist, because human beings don't react as homo economicus, is a great overstatement, because human beings do not act only in a human being way. They act through institutions and other things that mediate their decisions. We act in response to the price of cars. We act in response to the cost of insurance. We act in response to being members of firms or stockholders of firms or buyers do that. And the moment we act that way, that institution causes us, because it has its own attributes and way to do it, to act in a way that is different. I think it is too strong to say, because there are firms, therefore we can simply analyze the commons as we did before we looked at human beings as being also not straight homo economicus, because there is part of how firms behave and part of the commons which will still be influenced by individuals acting in a non-economic way. So it's a simple statement. We can talk about the commons as it was. Probably, I don't know, I haven't looked at it, is too strong. Just as the simple statement, you don't need to worry about the fact that people act in individual, non-maximizing way, doesn't matter, because through insurance and prices of cars, they will all act in ways which causes the price of cars to reflect safety. That sometimes happens, in malpractice it doesn't. You have to look at individual cases. So I would say to you, look to individual cases, but certainly don't buy this all or nothing thing that these people are pushing, because it hasn't made sense in other areas, and it certainly doesn't make sense for a reason you say, but even apart from a reason you say.
Yeah, but it gives a tremendous predictive strength to economic analysis of law, because, say, imagine, like, for example, this example, this thing that they were looking at. You just said before in the discussion there are certain things that you basically spoil with money, right? Love. Take Facebook, for example. Facebook basically has been capable, the firm that has produced Facebook as a network, okay, has been able to commodify friendship, for example, to the point of making huge fortunes for its shareholders by the fact that people go on Facebook and interact with each other in a completely friendly base, with no direct profit from each other, of course, but with a tremendous positive spillover effect for the firm itself that basically has been capable of transferring that, even that kind of feeling into a money-making kind of activity, which can be explained with what she was saying. You know? Okay, the Chicago, we might hate the kind of war that we present, but it looks like more realistic than the kind of war that you present in the moment in which you say, I take into consideration a variety of...
I don't see why it's more realistic in the world that I present. What that says to me is that if there is a value in altruism, and I hadn't really thought of this Facebook thing as one of it, because I am so ancient and so antediluvian, and I don't know about these things, and as a judge, it would be improper for me to be on Facebook and exchange these things for any number of reasons, because the judges have to face this or whatever, I don't know. But anyway, but what I would describe that as happening is here there is a tremendous value in people's utility functions of having a non-market reflected altruism, non-self-seeking. Somebody has been able, very cleverly, to find a way to get the market value of that, to some extent, separated out, and has appropriated it. All this shows is how much value we actually put on this altruism, which the economists before told us had no value at all. Wasn't there at all. So that for me is a perfect example of how much altruism looked as an end rather than as a means is something of value, and those nice people, or not nice people, I don't know what they are, who were able to pull out something they could put a price on and sell it, have been able to appropriate. That's great. But that just shows again how the two things are not separate, and how the problem of the commons exists just as much in the face of what is, to me, not irrational, not non-market behavior, but is simply an example of people having things in their utility functions that economists previously denied were there. Of people liking champagne rather than water, sex rather than bull farms. That's all that's going on. And if somebody is able to appropriate that, put a price on it and sell it, so much for that.
Well, except that it's not, I mean, it's good for him, but it's not good for society. Why so much?
That's a different question.
No, it's very different.
No, that's a different question.
Yeah.
That's a different question. That's why this more sophisticated economic theory, then you test against law. And let me give you an example, an earlier example of people appropriating. We like the idea of hospitals being beneficent, not for profit. Okay? We like it. It makes us feel good. There have been people who have been able to appropriate the funds, the money that creates. Because hospitals are not for profit, money is not given to shareholders, and so on. There is no one in the United States who is paid more as a chief executive officer for the work that they do than the managers of hospitals. They have appropriated the money that would go elsewhere because they are able still to sell it as not-for-profit and therefore meet what we want and are willing to pay for, but we can't buy it, and yet do it in a way. These people have been made rich in a different way, but the same way that the Facebook. Now, is that good for society or not? Is this extra amount of money that this idiot person who runs the Yale New Haven Hospital, don't repeat, that earns, which is 10 times what I earned when I was dean, doing a much more difficult job. Is that worth it because people who go into that business need special incentives, or is it a little monopoly that they have set up for themselves, which we should destroy? There's now, people are beginning now for the first time to focus on whether this is something that ought to be regulated.
Yeah, that's probably lacking a legal definition of a common. Though.
Well, of course. I mean,
because if you say it's a non-profit, it's a
look again. What has happened in your rather sloppy way, if I may say so, looking at, not yours, but people who have done that, is exactly the law and thing that I suggested, which has caused us to look at this situation in a more sophisticated way with respect to law and economics, and has said one of the interesting things is that since we want altruism, which we learn from looking at the real world, we are willing to pay for altruism in ways that don't destroy it, but some of the ways that we are willing to pay for it are ways that allow certain people to appropriate the profits of it. And then we ask the question, is that a good thing or a bad thing? The answer to that question, you and I, maybe simplistically say is obvious. Somebody may more carefully look at it and say it's actually a little more complicated. To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. But look at how much carefully we are now, more carefully, we are now looking at a problem and hopefully going towards a good solution than before we did this law and economics, rather than economic analysis of law, way of looking at it. We now can ask the questions. Intuitively, I'm quite happy with your intuitive answer. Somebody's going to go down and do a study, and I hope it's a person who does it, not with an ideological point of view of Chicago to begin with, but who actually looks at this and says, hey, very nice. You're just giving me another section of mine.
I'm Dennis, and
non ti sento, non ti ho mai sentito.
I'm Dennis.
No, speak loud because it's not just him and
I'm Dennis, and I'm a second-year student at IUC. My question is, what is the current status? What the current status of the global legal theory and legal culture in the era of globalization? I mean, related to law and economics. In the era of globalization and, as Hugo said, of artificial beings, powerful artificial beings.
So, I take the question is, what is the position, the situation of law and economics in an era of globalization, when you have these power structures across the world and so on? There have been, since the crisis, any number of meetings of any number of people, ranging from ministers, super ministers, pseudo ministers, professors, business people, all the way down on globalization and the crisis and economics. And what is interesting is that there have been any number of people who have approached that from, as you would expect, a rather traditional economic analysis of law, and taken economic theories and looked at the crisis and looked at the global world and said, therefore we have to do this. Some of what they've come up with is interesting just because this hasn't been done in the past. And when you use the machine in any new way, you do learn some things which are interesting about what happens and what doesn't happen. There have been a few who have looked at it and say, but why is it that in the actual world we don't have these structures, we don't have these things? What is there about it? Those who have looked at it from a law and economics point of view. They have not been as rigorous or even as thorough. In part because I don't think that there are that many law and economics scholars, and those that there are have not especially been interested in globalization. The result is that if nothing happens of people like you getting into it from a law and economics point of view, and look at that in the same way that Hugo is looking at the problem of the commons in that way, then the economic analysts will simply win out and do something which may be of some interest but will not be anywhere near as what is needed. So, now Woody.
It's just very like from Sierra Leone. It's just something to contribute to what you just said. I don't see how the law and economics theory can look at the situation in a globalized world when the law itself in a globalized world is so fragmented that it cannot hold a center to address these issues that the economics dismisses. And that's my problem with this talk, because I don't see the reason why the law should be the platform from which we see the reality of the world to address these issues that economics doesn't. When in my perspective, the law has been used to justify these issues that economics doesn't, you know.
Okay. If you assume that the way law is right, and therefore you redo economics so that it will explain law, you are making as big a mistake as if you take economics as right and apply it to law. Because law describes a world, institutions, which itself, as Mill said, may, to the extent it is not explained by Bentham's theory, represent the unanalyzed wisdom and experience of the human race. But Mill went on and said that it also represents centuries of exploitation, of people taking advantage, of theories and practices that are no longer valid. Law itself is not the place to change the world. If it were, we wouldn't need law, and we would go back to law as the formalistic system which has its values there, and our only job as legal scholars is to make it coherent. Until somebody says it is so wrong that we have to destroy it by revolution, écraser l'enfant, destroy it, and build a new system which is just as exploitative in a different way. The problem is, if you know that law must be criticized, but that no theory is able to criticize it fully, because even Bentham's theory couldn't do it, then you can't take either law or the theory as the answer. You must use one to ask the question about the other. And then analyze, and when you have analyzed, say, this is simply a not very important part of economics which can be changed, like markets are costly, do cost, or we have altruism in our utility functions, or a total wealth distribution doesn't mean that we want everything to be allocated according to it. In each of these, which are fairly simple changes in economics, which then help you to understand the legal world and say, oh yes, it makes sense. At other times, when you have gone through that, you look at it and you say, no, here is something where the explanation is not in making economics more sophisticated, but it's simply that law represented past exploitation or past ideas that are bad, and let's get rid of it. You know, the job, ultimately, of deciding what is good and what is bad is something that you are going to have to do. And law is part bad and part good, and so is economics. This is what Corbin told us. The reason for going through each of these is that it is very easy for people to say simply, this is good and this is bad, without analysis. But that gives advantage to, by and large, people in power who simply say that and do it. Oh, don't you understand that's the way it is? And that the job of the person who would reform and change things for the better is to analyze, knowing that ultimately there will come a moment of normativity where that person has to come out and say what Arthur Left, my colleague, once said, that burning babies is wrong. Whether law or economics says it's okay. And I don't want for a moment to act as if law and makes law imperialistic. I am reacting to an approach that makes economics imperialistic and says it's a two-way street in the hope that the two-way street will cause us to see better. I also said, in answer to your question earlier, that it may be that when you look at it in a two-way street, you still have to then look down other lanes as well and say, all right, this leaves us uncomfortable. We can't deal with it in economics, and yet law still leaves us uncomfortable. What does literature, what does anthropology tell us? Again, not as an answer, but as a way other people systematically have looked at things. And it may be that in those ways we find some answers that help us avoid both the vague generalities and the exploitation. Or it may not. My own feeling is that no matter how many we bring in, and no matter how sophisticated, ultimately there will become a value judgment. And at that point, you must stand and be counted. I won't say you must stand naked, but in a way you do. You stand naked with your views and let people say yes or no. You do what Luther, not a person I particularly like, by the way, because he was a bigot in any number of other ways, but one does admire the fact that at a certain point he puts, here stand ich, die kann nicht anders, God help me here. You know, here I stand, I can do nothing else, God help me. It's a point at which we all have to come to that. Oh, Explorer,
Yeah, I think
you're going to have to stop because otherwise we won't pick up again.